also developing around the same time, the 17th and 18th century, is more modern forms of science. You know, science at this time, 1600s into the 1700s, infancy stages as a modern approach. Now, there have been some scientific types of examinations, explorations, those kind of things, discoveries. But it's really from the 1500s on that you're seeing this greater interest in exploring the natural world as well as the human body, exploring the universe, finding out, discovering how things work, and the assumption being that we are created in such a way that God does not have to always, that we as human beings and the universe is created in such a way that He does not always have to be involved in making sure we continue to exist. That there are ways in which God has established certain laws or patterns of existence in the universe. And so, you know, this developing notion, again, centered in God, right? That God is the one who has done this, but the assumption being that we can understand this, that we live and the world around us exists according to certain natural types of things that are discoverable and understandable, right? So how blood circulates through the body, magnetism and magnetic poles, other types of things are slowly being discovered and determined by these early scientists who, you know, often didn't see themselves as scientists. That's not the term they used. Natural philosopher was one that was often used. But sometimes we're talking about people who are priests or other religious officials who are starting these explorations, some of which you know, bring them into conflict with church authorities. An example of this is a man named Galileo, who was born in Italy, and Galileo really kind of takes off of the work of a previous scientist, a man named Copernicus, who had began to postulate that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, but instead the sun was, and that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the Earth. So here's Galileo, and ends up confirming Copernicus's findings through the use of a telescope. But, and we might say, well, of course, everybody knows that that this takes place. But that wasn't the way people viewed it. A lot of religious people, a lot of religious authorities viewed the, you know, heliocentric model, the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system, as being incompatible with what the Bible taught. And so they assumed that the Bible taught that the Earth was the center. It was a geocentric model. And so when Copernicus and Galileo start talking about the sun being the center, you know, that was in conflict to their view of what Scripture said. And so Galileo gets into a lot of trouble with Catholic officials because of these claims, which leads him to say, leads him to believe that maybe the church hierarchy doesn't have the ability to determine the truthfulness of scientific matters. You know, that they've not done these observations and explorations where if they would see the truth, so they're not qualified to make those kind of decisions. So what we see here is the beginnings of this idea of science and religion being two separate forms of knowledge, one of which is trying to judge the other, but is not qualified to do so. And of course, what makes this more difficult for the relationship is the amount of trouble that Galileo gets into. Right? He's thrown in prison. He's under house arrest, I should say. He's prohibited from writing or speaking about his discoveries. Of course, he continues to do so. But this, of course, gives Christianity a very, very bad reputation in more modern times because of the ways in which Christians responded to this approach. Things were slightly different for English scientists, English natural philosophers. Particularly a man named Francis Bacon. So while Galileo, in a Catholic setting, finds himself in trouble with the Catholic Church, Bacon, in more of a Protestant setting in the Church of England, doesn't find himself in as much conflict with religious officials. And essentially what Bacon is trying to do is that he wants to develop an approach to scientific discovery, a method for examining facts and then determining theories. Now, what this is often referred to as the inductive approach. So what Bacon said you should do is you should go out and collect facts, examine facts, and then make determinations, develop general principles. So if you wanted to study, let's say, apples, right? You examined all the apples you could find. You looked at the development of them, and then you made certain conclusions about apples, right? Apples are X, Y, Z. Right? And so the idea is that you've gained insight here. You developed a principle about apples because you've examined different occurrences of apples. Slightly different than the other approach, which of course would be to develop a theory or hypothesis and then develop a test that would prove or disprove that hypothesis. So this inductive approach as opposed to a deductive approach. But essentially what we have here is, again, while we had reason developing on the one hand, which is that's continuing, we'll talk about that more in here in a minute, then you also have science developing. And at the time, again, a lot of these people saw themselves as Christians, sought to understand how the universe works, and how God made the universe, or how God established the workings of the universe. Right? So there's not a denial here of God. But what they're doing is establishing sources of authority that are independent of religion, they're independent of Christianity, and that often are used to make judgments about Christianity. Which leads to a philosophical period known as the Enlightenment. And so the philosophical movements of the 17th century, the ones we've just been talking about, gives way to this period in the 18th century that really emphasized the importance of empiricism, investigation, and this mechanistic view of the universe, right? That the universe operates according to certain laws. And the purpose of that was to discover those laws. And so the Enlightenment ended up having a lot of impact on art and on economics and politics and criminal punishment, but has a very important impact on religion. So there were a couple of themes that were very important for Enlightenment thinkers. First was the idea that the universe is rational. It operates according to rational principles that are discovered. They are best discovered through the reason. Secondly, truth came through empirical observation. Okay? Not appeal to revelation, not appeal to God inspiring someone, revealing something, but instead you determined truth as you observed things, as you investigated them empirically. But particularly important was the emphasis on the power and the abilities of human experience. That was the foundation for understanding, was what human beings have experienced. Ultimately, of course, the Enlightenment believed in progress, that we were more enlightened now than we had been in the past, and that we were going to continue to be developing all of this. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers didn't completely discount religion, but they began to question certain things within religion, like the power of religious authorities. Right? That religious authorities didn't always have the best understanding of truth or reality. That there was an important way in which the natural world and human experience was more important than the supernatural world, because that was something that couldn't be experienced. And so all of these things are, again, kind of providing alternatives to religion as an explanation for who we are, where we're going, where we come from, all those kind of big questions. Now, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, again, were still religious to some extent, but they boiled religion down to only those things that could be discovered through abstract reason, which meant that many of them rejected revelation, rejected miracles, because those things did not appear to be rational. Now, many of them believed in God. They're not becoming atheists, most of them. Right? We have a created world, and in the 18th century, it was still reasonable to believe that it had to come from somewhere, or something, or someone, a being, so there must be a creator God for a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers. And there was still someone that was responsible for the existence of the universe. So that was rational. That could still be held on to. A lot of Enlightenment thinkers also believed in the afterlife. And you say, okay, well, how do you get to the afterlife through reason alone? Well, for a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, they looked at the cyclical nature, or the cyclical nature of the world. And when you look at the seasons, right, things grow during the spring and summer, die off in the fall and winter, but then are reborn in the spring. Now, they're not developing a reincarnation theory. They're still very heavily affected by Christian views of the afterlife. But they believe that they could come to this conclusion that there was something after death, because that's how we see the natural world existing. Right? The spring follows fall and winter. Also very important for a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, though not all, was the moral teachings of Jesus. They believed that Jesus' teachings on how to live, how to be ethical, were rational and were good intellectual truths, important principles, let's say, that should be followed. Although a lot of them all rejected the idea of Jesus being the Son of God. It wasn't rational for God to become a human being for a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. But they still believed that Jesus had special insight into morality that should be followed, and that was useful and reasonable, even though some of the claims of Christianity, some of the claims of the Bible, like Jesus' miraculous works, the identity of Jesus, the essence of Jesus, those kind of things, were rejected, but there were still some things, some elements of Christianity that were still held on to. The others, of course, this wasn't kind of just left unchallenged. While this Enlightenment thinking is going on, the skepticism that's developing here. There were others who, often influenced by Francis Bacon's approach, who said, well, there's an obviousness to the rational order of nature, and the ordinary experience proves reality, and so we can be intuitively certain of the reality of ourselves, the reality of objects, and the principles of morality and religious beliefs. So there's this attempt, this Scottish Enlightenment, that's trying to hold on to some elements of revelation that the major Enlightenment in Europe is rejecting. Right? So there's this attempt to try and hold on to, but again through reason and through empiricism, and less so about revelation. So even in the more orthodox forms of the Enlightenment, the more traditional forms of the Enlightenment, there was still this emphasis on the power of reason, right? And that reason can determine truth and doesn't need God as much as previous generations perhaps did. And God as far as revelation, right? The need for God to reveal something. This, of course, has some very significant political developments. That with religion becoming more and more of a personal or private matter, becoming more of a approach that is distinct from reason and what rationality, something that all human beings could experience. That has some significant effects politically. We're going to talk about the American Revolution in another session, but I want to use the French Revolution here as an example of kind of the extremes that some in Europe were going to based on some of these things of the Enlightenment. Now, it wasn't solely the Enlightenment that leads to the French Revolution. There's a lot of economic problems in France. There's a lot of tension between the religious officials, the priests, and the nobles. There's tension between the nobles and the common people. There's tension between the common people and the priests, right? So there's a lot of economic tension, social tension. The people stormed the Bastille, so there's opposition to the crown. There are attempts to lay out the rights of human beings, rights of the citizens. And in doing so, there is this appeal to natural law, which had developed as early as Aquinas, is present in John Locke, a lot of other thinkers in the English Enlightenment, but this notion that there are these natural laws that are distinct from revelation, and that very important in natural law was the idea that human beings should be allowed the utmost of freedom. And in so doing, that included religious freedom, even for the extremes of the French Revolution, as long as your religious freedoms and the practice of your religious freedoms did not impinge on someone else or disturb public order. And so what we're seeing here is this idea of religion being more of a private matter that shouldn't have a coercive political power. And probably a lot of us would say, well, yeah, we agree with that. And Christianity we would say is more about persuasion than about force. But what we see here is, this idea of religion is a private matter that doesn't have or shouldn't have public influence on society because it is a matter of conscience. It's a matter of privacy. It is as frequently shows up in these documents that were developed among French politicians, it is a matter of opinion. It's less a matter of faith and truth, and it's more a matter of opinion. Right? And so one of the documents that comes out of all this, the French Parliament, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, in which it says, no one shall be disquieted, right, upset or disturbed on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Right? So the realm of your opinions, you should be free to have those opinions, and in those opinions include your religious views. Other documents further restrict the authority of the Catholic Church as we go through the latter part of the 18th century. And of course, there is some war that develops between France and other parts of Europe. Eventually, a lot of the animosity, as France is losing, is focused on the king. So the king's overthrown, and so there's this revolution that takes place in France. And enemies of the revolution are facing the guillotine and what's called the Reign of Terror. And a lot of these revolutionaries are anti-religious and believe that, they're their highest thinkers. They've been influenced by science and reason, right? So this is kind of, there's the Enlightenment foundation, this taken to the extremes and, fully being expressed in this political movement. And so these revolutionaries think that religion is something that needs to be removed entirely from the public square, but you need something like religion in order to have communal bonds. And so the cult of reason is developed, which is like, it's a social organization that provided the functions of religion, the communal ties, the interactions, the group identity, without what they consider to be the superstitious aspects of religion, like deities, the supernatural, and a lot of religious, priests, nuns, etc., you couldn't accept this, and so there was persecution, there was imprisonment, sometimes death. Again, the French Revolution is an extreme, but you see how this is kind of a lot of the trajectories we've been seeing. Reason and science as separate forms of authority that are greater than religious authority. The power of and the sanctity of the human conscience. But religion being something of the matter of opinion. Right? All of these things are coming to a head in the French Revolution. And although when Napoleon takes over France, he allows a variety of rights back to the Catholic Church that had been eliminated under the Reign of Terror, there is still this foundation that's taking place in Europe that is making its way over to the United States as well, where you have this juncture between religion, specifically Christianity, and other aspects of human life. Now, that's not to diminish the power that Christianity still had in the lives of millions of people in Western civilization. And even today, millions, billions, right, worldwide are Christians. So Christianity still has a lot of power. But the ways in which Christianity functions in contemporary society, we see kind of the seeds of this in the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, as to what Christianity is and what it should be in public life.